The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am running the 100-meter dash with Rita Young, the new Survivor Investigator for the Survivor class, who will be released in The Circle Undone. Earlier this month, Fantasy Flight Games released a preview for Rita, as well as Carolyn Fern, the Guardian Investigator, in the box. FFG was kind enough to spoil Rita's deck building options, so I thought I would share my first impressions of her and provide a couple of deck ideas so that you can hit the ground running when she is released. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Can Rita Young really outrun the Mythos? Well, let's find out. Rita Young has 3 willpower, 2 intellect, 3 combat, and 5 agility. She has the Miskatonic trait, 9 health, and 5 sanity. She has the following response: after you evade an enemy, either deal 1 damage to that enemy or move to a connecting location, limit once per round. Her Elder Sign effect is +2, and until the end of the round, Rita may ignore the limit on her response. Let's start off by breaking down Rita's stats. She has 3 willpower, which is average. Normally I wouldn't consider that to be much of a problem. After all, not every investigator can be Agnes Baker. However, Rita only has 5 sanity, which does not give her much room for error. Now, I'm not too worried about her taking horror from enemies, since Rita can evade most of them easily enough. If you draw Rotting Remains from the encounter deck, however, odds are you are going to be taking some horror, unless you can commit 1 or 2 cards and or resources to the skill test, and you really don't have a lot of sanity to spare. Rita will also struggle against other willpower treacheries, such as Arcane Barrier. Shoring up Rita's sanity is going to be a priority whether you're playing solo or multiplayer. When I see a Survivor Investigator with a low sanity, my first inclination is to reach for Peter Sylvester. The level 0 version of Peter boosts Rita's agility and provides a sanity buffer until she can upgrade to the level 2 version, which buffs her willpower by 1. Taking some of the pressure off her hand and resources. Besides Peter Sylvester, Survivor Investigators have several options to boost their willpower and or shore up their sanity, including Guts, Cherished Keepsake, Lucky, and Perseverance, a Survivor event from Threads of Fate. In addition to the 2 willpower skill icons, Perseverance is nice because it can cancel up to 4 damage and or horror that would defeat you. It's a nice panic button to have in your backpack if the game does go south. Rita has 2 intellect, which is below average. Obviously, Rita spent a lot more time running laps at the track than hitting the books at the Orin Library. Some of my most memorable solo campaigns have featured investigators with below average intellect, so this doesn't bother me as much as long as there are some tools available to help gather clues. Rita is going to be slower out of the starting blocks than a high intellect investigator until she finds those tools that she needs to help her discover clues. But there are plenty of tools to choose from, including flashlight, perception, look what I found, lucky, newspaper, and winging it. Scavenging is out of the question though, since it's highly unlikely Rita will succeed by 2 on investigate actions. These types of cards are going to be a high priority if you're playing solo or in a group of 2, less so if you're playing in a group of 3 or more, where investigators tend to specialize a lot more. Running a low intellect investigator is risky though. Drawing an early obscuring fog while you're at a key location could ruin Rita's day, since she'll have a difficult time mustering enough intellect to dissipate the fog. If Rita gets locked out of a location, she has only one way to cheat a clue, that being Gravedigger's Shovel from the Path to Carcosa. Parlay actions will also give Rita headaches, since many of them require willpower or intellect skill tests. Rita will definitely need to wear the finest tracksuit that she can afford if she hopes to persuade characters such as Jazz Mulligan, Constance Dumaine, or Ichtaka to help her during scenarios. Rita has an average combat skill of 3. That's okay, because Rita prefers to evade enemies if she can help it. Rita's special ability lets her inflict 1 damage on an enemy if she evades it, which is a nice perk, However, 1 damage isn't going to be enough to kill most enemies outright, and enemies with the hunter keyword or bosses can be very tenacious. If Rita confronts the Ghoul Priest, for example, she could always try killing him by evading him 5 times, but I think you'll agree that's an awfully slow solution to that problem. Rita should probably have a weapon to deal with hunters and bosses, as well as any cultists that appear with doom on them. Speaking of cultists, a weapon will also come in handy if she needs to deal with her signature weakness, hoods, since those clan impersonators will tag Rita for a damage and a horror whether she successfully evades them or not. As we saw earlier, Rita really doesn't have the sanity to be tanking enemies for long, so she'll probably need to kill a few here or there to keep them off her back. Realistically, survivors have 3 options for weapons at level 0: fire axe, baseball bat, and a gravedigger shovel. Most players reach for the fire axe first because it provides a generous boost to your combat skill value, and it deals extra damage as long as you have no resources. It also synergizes nicely with Dark Horse if you decide to go that route. Baseball bat will boost Rita's combat and damage, but it does have a nasty tendency to break at the worst of times. I think the bigger problem with the baseball bat is not so much that it will break, it's that it takes up both hand slots. Rita's intellect isn't great, which means she'll probably need a flashlight or newspaper to help her discover clues, and those don't really play ball with the baseball bat. Gravedigger shovel is a tempting option for Rita. Rita has a combat value of 5 while armed with the shovel, which is very good. The shovel does lack a damage bonus, but Rita's ability to damage enemies through evasion can mitigate that downside somewhat. More importantly, the shovel is Rita's only way to cheat a clue if she gets locked out by a high shroud location or obscuring fog. Resourceful is a staple in survivor decks these days, so Rita does have a way to get the shovel back if she happens to discard it. Rita has an agility of 5, making her the most agile investigator in the game. Agility still feels as though it's the weakest stat in the game. That said, agility stock went up significantly during the Forgotten Age cycle. Evasion was tricky to pull off during that cycle due to the nature of the exploration deck, the relatively small maps, and the alert keyword, but agility tests appeared on many encounter cards, including the Rope Bridge, Snakebite, and my personal bugbear, Entombed. There's nothing quite like getting entombed and then drawing an enemy or 2, or vice versa. If you're playing one of the earlier campaigns, Rita's impressive agility will protect her from treachery such as Grasping Hands, On Wings of Darkness, and Ruin and Destruction. Agility is also helpful during scenarios such as the Essex County Express, Undimensioned and Unseen, Curtain Call, and Black Star's Rise. Escaping enemies won't be a problem for Rita, especially if she includes cards that add to her agility, like Peter Sylvester and Track Shoes, which we'll look at a bit later. It's what she does once she escapes them that I'm concerned about. That brings us to Rita's special ability, which is somewhat similar to Survival Instinct, a survival skill from the core set. Once per round, if Rita evades an enemy, she may trigger her response to either deal 1 damage to that enemy or move to a connecting location. Rita's special ability, coupled with her low intellect, suggests she's more effective in multiplayer than solo. Rita is effectively blank unless there are enemies in play, ideally at her location, and she doesn't have access to any sort of encounter deck manipulation like the Guardians do to make sure that happens. If you're playing solo, you may only see a dozen or so encounter cards during a scenario. If the vast majority of those are treacheries, Rita doesn't get to be Rita, and you'll probably be wondering why you didn't play a more interesting investigator. If you're playing multiplayer, odds are the group will see a lot more enemies as it cycles through the encounter deck, and Rita will certainly have a chance to shine as she runs circles around them. The decision of whether to damage an enemy or move depends a great deal on the situation Rita finds herself in. If you're engaged with an enemy that you or your group can safely avoid for the remainder of the scenario, moving is probably a better option. The ability to move to a connecting location is like taking a free action, and of course in this game, free actions are always welcome. However, that assumes that you've got somewhere useful to move, which might not be the case depending on the campaign. The Dunwich Legacy and the Path to Carcosa campaigns give investigators a lot more room to maneuver than the Forgotten Age. Judging from the Wages of Sin preview, which is I believe it's the second Mythos pack in the Circle Undone cycle, I'd like to think the Circle Undone scenarios will have larger maps than the Forgotten Age, but at this point that's just a guess. If the enemy has the Hunter keyword, the choice becomes more difficult. If you're confident that Rita can keep the Hunter at arm's length, moving is still a good idea. The Hunter will be exhausted, so it won't give chase for at least one turn. That gives Rita some time to put some more distance between herself and the enemy. However, if the map is on the small side and there is the potential for Rita to get cornered, she's probably better off standing her ground, softening up the Hunter with a point of damage so she or another member of the group can finish the job with a weapon later that round. Rita doesn't mind being chased by enemies, but she doesn't really like being caught due to her low sanity. Rita's Elder Sign effect is +2, and until the end of the round, Rita may ignore the limit on her response. Elder Sign abilities tend to be a mixed bag, and it's difficult to build a strategy around them since you never know when you're going to draw an Elder Sign, unless, of course, your name is Father Mateo and you can draw one whenever you like with your signature asset. Rita gets a +2 bonus to her skill value if she draws an Elder Sign, which is quite good compared to the bonus for other investigators. However, the actual ability feels a little bit weak because Rita's response is already quite situational, and this is even more so. Ideally, Rita would like to draw the Elder Sign during a skill test during the Mythos phase so she can try to abuse her special ability later that round. But let's be honest, that's not going to happen very often. More often than not, you'll draw the Elder Sign at some point during your turn, and more often than not, you're not going to be in a position to capitalize on it because there are no enemies around or you don't have any actions remaining, or both. I just don't see myself being able to take advantage of this ability in a meaningful way all that often. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, of course, it's just it's going to happen so rarely that I, for one, will be really shocked if it has an impact on most games. I think most games, you're just not going to be able to use it. Let's move on to Rita's signature cards, of which there are two, an event called I'm Done Runnin' and a weakness, an enemy called Hoods. I'm Done Runnin' is a free event with a combat agility and wild skill icons and the spirit trait. It is fast and you may play it only during your turn. It has the game text, ready and engage all enemies at your location for the remainder of your turn. Whenever you engage an enemy, instead of exhausting and disengaging from that enemy, you may deal it 1 damage. All other effects of the successful evasion still apply. Now, I've read this card a few dozen times now, and I'm still not sure I entirely understand it, so I'm going to break it down line by line. Let's assume for a moment that Rita plays this card in the player window that opens before her first action. First, she readies and engages all enemies at her location. That includes aloof enemies, so I'm Done Runnin' could be useful to pull things such as the Whippoorwills or the Man in the Pallid Mask. Obviously, the big question here is how many enemies are we talking about? Because it seems somewhat suicidal for Rita to engage a lot of enemies, especially enemies that deal horror, since she really doesn't have the sanity to tank them for very long. Rita does have the option to evade the enemies she engages with I'm Done Running if necessary. However, if she exhausts them, she's not damaging them, which seems kind of like the point behind playing the card in the first place. Let's assume that Rita engages a couple of enemies. The question is, now what? Well, if Rita evades one of them, she's got a choice to make. Does she exhaust the enemy and disengage from it, or does she damage it, in which case the enemy remains ready and engaged with her? If Rita damages the enemy, she has the option of evading it again to deal another damage. She could do that up to 3 times, dealing a total of 4 damage, 3 for I'm done running and 1 for her response. That's not a very efficient use of Rita's time, since she could potentially do 6 damage if she hits the enemy with a fire axe or baseball bat 3 times. If the stars align and Rita draws an elder sign before she plays I'm done running, she might be able to deal 6 damage with it, but that's going to be very rare indeed. Rita could play I'm done running in combination with cards such as Cunning Distraction, Fire Extinguisher, and level 2 Survival Instinct, which would let her evade multiple enemies at once. Rita would get the choice of whether to evade or damage each of them, turning herself into a mini dynamite blast. That seems okay. If you're interested in this sort of tactic, level 2 Survival Instinct is probably your best bet, since it's much cheaper than Cunning Distraction, and it lacks the exile keyword of Fire Extinguisher. If Rita engages a bunch of enemies that she is unable to evade or kill with I'm done running, she could play Infighting, a level 3 card from Dim Carcosa, to cancel all attacks made by non-elite enemies against her during this phase. That would give Rita another turn to evade the enemies again, or possibly kill one if she triggered her response. Infighting is a pretty narrow card, though, so I'd be very hesitant to play it in the hope of setting up some sort of elaborate combination with I'm done running. I'm not really blown away by I'm done running. Much like Rita's response, it's a very situational card, and while I can certainly think of situations where the card would be useful, I can also see myself drawing it and wishing it was a different card altogether. It's not a particularly efficient way to kill enemies either, unless you combine it with cards that evade multiple enemies at once. More often than not, I suspect I will be committing this to a skill test for the 2 combat or 2 agility skill icons. Rita's signature weakness, Hoods, is an enemy with 3 fight, 3 health, and 3 evade. It has the humanoid and cultist traits and the alert and hunter keywords. It has the forced effect after you evade Hoods, it attacks you. Hoods deals 1 damage and 1 horror. Now, Hoods is a fairly annoying card since it does use Rita's strength against her. If Rita evades Hoods, she takes a damage and a horror. If she tries and fails to evade Hoods, she also takes a damage and a horror due to the alert keyword. Now, Rita can try to put some distance between herself and Hoods, but it does have the hunter keyword, so it will pester her all scenario if she lets it. That could be a problem if the map is small or the scenario features a lot of enemies. In my experience, enemy weaknesses always seem to appear when you're already engaged with an enemy or 2, and throwing 1 more on top of there from your draw deck just adds insult to injury. It's worth noting that Hoods does have the cultist trait, which is significant for scenarios that feature the dark cult encounter set. The last thing Rita needs to do is pull a mysterious chanting, and forcing her to place 2 doom on the Hoods. Depending on the doom threshold of the agenda deck, Rita may not have a choice but to confront the Hoods head on and take them out if they do end up somehow with doom on them. If I was playing Rita solo, I'd probably just stand my ground and take out the Hoods with a weapon. An axe, a shovel, or a bat will make short work of it and make your life a lot easier down the road. If you don't have a weapon handy, you could defeat the Hoods by evading it 3 times, triggering Rita's response each time, but she will take 3 damage and 3 horror in the process, which is pretty severe as far as weaknesses go. Rita can shrug off the damage due to her 9 health, but the horror does sting quite a bit. I would probably want to have either level of Peter Sylvester in play if I wanted to use that sort of tactic against Hoods. FFG's preview article spoiled Rita's deck building options and requirements, which are actually quite restrictive. Rita's deck can include survivor and neutral cards, of course, as well as level 0 to level 3 cards with the trick trait. Now, I'm somewhat surprised and a little disappointed by Rita's deck building options. I'm surprised because I felt certain that the trick trait would be the sole domain of Dexter Drake, the Magician, if and when he is released in the Arkham Horror LCG. I'm a little disappointed because I don't think the trick trait really has that much to offer Rita. There are currently 14 cards with the trick trait, and the vast majority of those are in the rogue class. Let's take a quick look at them, and I think you'll see what I mean. I'm Outta Here is a situational card at best. It's great in certain scenarios. In others, you're just going to be committing it to the skill test for 2 agility skill icons. Situational cards like I'm Outta Here are fine in the rogue class, since rogues and off-class rogues can purchase adaptable, which lets them swap these cards in and out of their deck as the need arises. Rita can't purchase adaptable, which makes a card such as I'm Outta Here a tough sell for the duration of a campaign. You Handle This one is playable only in multiplayer, and I would be tempted to play it to offload willpower and or intellect skill tests on a more capable investigator. It's also cheaper both in terms of resources and experience points than the survival alternative, a test of will. However, Rita's willpower isn't nearly as dire as some of the other rogue investigators like Skids O'Toole or Finn. So you could take a pass on You Handle This one, as long as you've got some cards to shore up Rita's sanity. Ace in the Hole is probably the best trick card of the bunch, but it does cost 6 experience points due to that exceptional keyword, so it's unlikely Rita will be able to purchase this until mid to late campaign. We'll take a look at some of the other potential upgrades later in this video. Cheap Shot may see some play in Rita, since it does let her add her agility skill value to her combat skill value for an attack. If she succeeds by 2 or more, she automatically evades the enemy and deals 1 damage to it. 2 if she triggers her response. Rita has a combat skill value of 7 if she plays Cheap Shot, so odds are she will succeed by 2 if she plays this card. Eavesdrop and Persuasion, which is the only Seeker card on the list, both require intellect, which is not Rita's strong suit. I would take a pass on including these in a Rita deck. Sleight of Hand is a fantastic card in rogue and off-class rogues, who typically use it to bounce firearms in and out of play to maximize the number of ammo tokens they get during a scenario. Rita can't leverage Sleight of Hand quite as well at level 0, since there are few items worth bouncing, and Rita can get them back from the discard pile with Resourceful anyway. There's only one firearm in the Survivor class, Old Hunting Rifle from the Depths of Yoth, and it costs 3 experience points, so it's out of the question at level 0. I guess Rita could use Sleight of Hand to bounce a baseball bat or a flashlight in and out of play. If Rita drew a skull token breaking the bat would return to hand before it was discarded. So that's a neat trick. And of course, if you used it on flashlight, you get to stretch those supply tokens even further. Down the road, Rita could replace the baseball bat with the Old Hunting Rifle, or perhaps better, the Ornate Bow from Heart of the Elders, once she has earned some experience points. That leaves Slip Away and Think on Your Feet. Rita has a skill value of 7 with Slip Away, so odds are she'll succeed by 2, locking down an enemy for 2 turns. She'll also have a choice of damaging it or moving if she triggers her response, which is pretty good. I've heard a few players are really enjoying this card in Finn Edwards, and so I could certainly see it making the cut in Rita. As far as Think on Your Feet goes, it can save Rita in action if an enemy spawns at her location, but I think it's kind of redundant with her ability, so I don't see it being particularly essential to a Rita deck. That's it for the off-class trick cards. Of the 10 cards on the list, only 4, maybe 5 really interest Rita that much, and one of those does cost 6 experience points. That doesn't leave Rita with a whole lot of options to spice up her deck, especially at level 0, and that tempers my enthusiasm for her somewhat. I suspect most level 0 Rita decks are going to include a lot of generic good stuff survivor cards that we've come to know and love over the past 2 years. That's fine, of course, but you can play those cards in any old Survivor deck. They don't really give Rita the unique character or combinations that that usually come if you're allowed to include off-class cards in your deck. Now, Father Mateo, for one, has struggled with a similar problem since the start of the Forgotten Age cycle due to the lack of cards with the Blessed trait. Unfortunately, after 1 deluxe box and 6 Mythos packs, cards with the Blessed trait are still in short supply. So I'm hoping Rita will avoid that situation, and we'll see some more trick cards that seem destined to go in her deck as the cycle continues. Based on what we know about Rita's skills, abilities, and deck building options, we can get some idea of what a solo and multiplayer Rita build will look like going forward. I should emphasize that the following decks are really just rough drafts, since the Circle Undone, as well as the subsequent cycle, will almost certainly contain cards that are ideal for Rita. The solo Rita deck that I built focuses heavily on shoring up Rita's intellect and sanity. It includes cards such as Flashlight, Gravedigger, Shovel, Look What I Found, Lucky, Perception, and Unexpected Courage to help her discover clues in a timely fashion. Cherished Keepsake and Peter Sylvester should provide Rita with enough sanity to see her through a typical scenario. Waylay, a Survivor event from the Pallid Mask, seems like a very solid addition to a Rita deck given her amazing agility and the fact that she can evade enemies quite easily and then follow up with a Waylay. Not Without a Fight is a great way for Rita to boost either her combat or agility, while Resourceful, of course, lets her recycle the best Survivor cards in her deck. I think I'd also be willing to experiment with cards like Take Heart in place of Emergency Cash, or even Perseverance in place of Guts, just to make sure you have a little bit more protection for your sanity going forward. Sleight of Hand seems like a good addition in this deck. Playing Gravedigger Shovel for free to discover a clue without making an intellect skill test does seem strong. It also works wonders with Flashlight, as I mentioned before, allowing you to stretch those supplies even further. It's worth noting that Sleight of Hand also opens up some interesting options for upgrades later down the line. Now, you could certainly play Dark Horse in this sort of deck to boost all of Rita's skills. If you decide to go that route, I'd probably recommend swapping the Gravedigger Shovel for a Fire Axe and Peter Sylvester for Madame Labranche, just to give yourself a little bit more flexibility in the resource department. I'd probably also consider dropping Waylay, since it's quite expensive at 3 resources. Sleight of Hand, though, does fit nicely in here, since it lets you play that Flashlight or Gravedigger Shovel for 1 resource rather than 2. Now, the observant viewers among you will notice there are only 28 cards in this deck, and I will discuss my picks for the 29th and 30th card in a moment. A multiplayer Rita deck can drop most, if not all, of the cards that help her discover clues in favor of more evasion trickery. Of course, this depends whether you're playing Rita in a duo or in a group of 3 or 4. If you're playing in a duo, you probably want to keep a few of those investigation cards just to help out with the clue gathering. If you're playing 3 or 4, you can probably dispense with them entirely. Now, there are likely going to be more enemies on the table in multiplayer, so a card like Survival Instinct becomes more valuable. Dark Horse is also a viable option in this sort of deck if you decide to make a few tweaks. Again, there are only 28 cards in this deck at the moment, so there is some room to experiment. You could certainly swap in some of the, or swap out some of the events, say, for other evasion events like Slip Away if you wanted to. Now, I mentioned earlier that the next cycle will almost certainly contain cards that are ideal for Rita. One card that will almost certainly find a home in solo and multiplayer Rita builds is Track Shoes, which FFG spoiled in its preview article. Track Shoes is a 3-cost asset with an agility skill icon and the item, clothing, and footwear traits. I believe that's the first time we've seen that one. There is a limit of 1 footwear per investigator. While Track Shoes are in play, you get +1 agility. Track Shoes also has the following response after you move, but before enemies at your new location engage you, exhaust track shoes, test agility 3. If you succeed, move to a connecting location. Cards that let you boost a skill or take an extra action are very strong, and track shoes let you do both. Rita has an agility of 6 with the track shoes in play, which is fantastic any way you cut it. The shoes also let her take an additional move action each round, ignoring any enemies at her location, as long as she does take a move action first. There's no guarantee Rita will be able to take the additional move, since she does need to pass an agility 3 skill test first, but she really shouldn't be able to. That shouldn't be a very difficult hurdle to clear for her, given that she does have an agility of 6 with the track shoes in play. Of course, you are still at the mercy of the Chaos Bag. The underlying assumption here is that you do have somewhere useful to move. Track shoes would certainly come in handy during many scenarios in the Dunwich Legacy or the Path to Carcosa campaigns, probably less so during the Forgotten Age due to the nature of the exploration deck. Track shoes are going to be a great addition to a Rita deck, and I expect other investigators to covet them as well. Movement is a critical component of this game, and the ability to squeeze in an extra move without having to evade an enemy or enemies at a location first is extremely powerful. If you need proof, you can think back to the main path in the Devourer below. It can be teeming with enemies once you advance to Act 1B. If you've got a high enough agility or some agility skill icons to spare, track shoes makes bypassing all of those enemies almost trivial. And it's just not the Devourer below. I can think of similar situations in the Dunwich Legacy and the Path to Carcosa. The House Always Wins and the Unspeakable Oath come immediately to mind here. And I'm sure there are many other scenarios and situations where track shoes would be a real boon. Investigators hate being cornered, and track shoes will give them a leg up on the enemies. Really, really good card. Before we wrap up this look at Rita Young, let's take a look at some of the potential upgrades once she has earned some experience points. First, there are the power cards, such as Ace in the Hole, Key of Ys, and Will to Survive. If you'd like Rita to focus more heavily on evasion tech, you could purchase cards such as Close Call from the core set, or the level 2 version of Survival Instinct from Undimensioned and Unseen. Many of the skills in a Rita deck do have the innate trait. Returning 3 of them to your hand from the discard pile with True Survivor from Black Star's Rise is a strong play. And did I mention that Rita is an amazing sniper with the ornate bow? If you're planning on adding archery to Rita's resume, I'd recommend playing Sleight of Hand in that build, since it does help you mitigate not only the cost of the bow, but also the ammo restriction on it. That's going to do it for my look at Rita Young. I have had a chance to play Rita solo a few times since the preview article dropped, and the deck performed pretty much as expected. First off, track shoes are absolutely amazing. It has helped me get out of many tight scrapes already, and I really can't imagine playing a Rita deck without that card. Really, really strong. The Sleight of Hand Gravedigger Shovel combination has helped me gather clues at High Shroud locations in all the games I've played, while Waylay let me take down the Servant of the Lurker in The House Always Wins. Winging It has also been a card of note, helping me at some of those High Shroud locations. As for Rita's special ability, it does create some interesting decision points. I tend to use it for the free movement, but it did help me take down the Wizard of Yogg-Sothoth in extracurricular activity. I've drawn only 1 Elder Sign so far, and as expected, I really couldn't make much use of it at all, because I just wasn't in a position to take advantage of it. Neither I'm Done Runnin' or Hoods has made it into play yet, so I can't really comment on those. I guess the biggest issue with Rita is, of course, that 2 intellect. While she's really amazing at evading enemies, that 2 intellect means she is slower, and I have been in situations where she has missed a key intellect or a key investigate action, and that has put her behind the 8 ball, and has made it to sort of I've had to scramble to finish a scenario before time ran out. But I mean, you are playing a 2 intellect investigator in solo, so you've got to expect and sort of try to do your best to prepare for those things. I know the one time it did happen where she just missed I had it all set up to pass the intellect test, and I drew a tentacle, and unfortunately I just couldn't get that clue because I ran into too many enemies. And I mean, that's just what happens sometimes. You can try to prepare for it all you can, but you're still at the mercy of the chaos bag. Now, like I said, playing a low intellect investigator solo is it's always going to be a challenge, but I think Rita does have the tools to succeed if she needs to. Compared to some of the other survivor investigators that I've played, such as Silas Marsh, I'd say Rita's probably behind him in terms of how much I've enjoyed playing the investigator. I really enjoyed playing Silas and the mechanics involved with him. Rita's special abilities are very situational, and they're just not generally good. They sort of let you do something rather than just give you something without having to do it. And it's just really like I guess I enjoyed Silas's, sort of the deck manipulation and moving skills in and out of play a little bit more than Rita. So that's my look at Rita, and I did enjoy playing her. I'm going to try to finish the campaign with her and see how she does in the end. I've had fun with her, and I do expect that players will have a lot of fun playing Rita once she is released in the Circle Undone in the months ahead. That's going to do it for my look at Rita Young. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you'd like to ask a question, you can always contact me at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.